Okay, I'm extremely happy to welcome Naomi Fink, who's a dear friend and one of the leading economists in town, when she's in Japan, and when she's in California, one of the leading economists there. And you obviously came to hear her, not me. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry.
Right. So today the topic is inflation and retirement. Retirement is something that is a preoccupation amongst, well, perhaps every country that has any type of pension or retirement system. It may be a preoccupation amongst those that don't. However, they yet do not have a policy to deal with it. Japan, alongside the US, has experienced similar trends, such as greater longevity. Japan experienced greater longevity far before the US. They've experienced lower fertility rates. They've generally experienced an aging society, much like most of the developed world. So, within the developed world, the challenge has been how to create a pension system that is sustainable given people are living longer and given higher dependency ratios. Now, that has been a piece of work in progress in many developed countries over many years. Now, we're in a situation where we're adding an additional fillip. Although retirement tended to be a policy question, a macroeconomic question about household savings, about labor, about human capital, we've now come back into an inflationary environment in many countries in the world, and that adds something new to the picture, something that I dare say is not going to make examining retirement policy much easier. Taking a look at what happens prior to retirement, I think we're all familiar with how there are different measures of inflation. The data that I use in this presentation are US data. I've done most of my work over the last 6 years on retirement using US data. However, we will abstract and take a look at theoretical models that may be calibrated to any country. So on the left-hand side here, we are taking a look at several different measures of inflation. We have CPI, the headline CPI in urban areas. That's the measure that is probably most commonly known. We also have the CPIE, which is not so commonly known. CPIE is a measure of inflation that's used for older households. It's an experimental measure, but it's one that captures the consumption basket of older, mostly retired households. And I don't know if you can tell by this chart, but it lags the CPI. Then we have the Social Security cost of living adjustment, which lags both of the others. Why? By construction. Social Security cost of living adjustment is based on several months of lagged inflation data. And once a year is set for the following year. So by construction, you have a lag for retirees. Even in the probably best scenario where you have an adjustment of costs. In Japan too, they do have cost adjustments. It's not the same formula. I know that in the years of deflation, luckily, perhaps for a lot of households, Japan didn't really adjust their cost of living implicit in the pension for deflation for many years. And then finally, after a couple, maybe a decade and a half, decided to make the adjustments. So it's even in the best situation, a lagging indicator. Maybe good in a deflationary scenario, the lag is not so positive in an inflationary scenario. On the right-hand side, we are taking a look at a couple of other indicators that are impacted by inflation. First, we have the personal consumption expenditures. And the prices implicit in the personal consumption expenditures is another commonly watched measure of inflation. But the expenditures themselves, as you see, rise and fall. Probably longer term, they have a lead on the personal savings rate. It's intuitive. You're probably going to be consuming. You probably have a floor on consumption, and then you make the savings decision based on what you think you're already going to consume. Nearer term, you might also observe that there's an apparent inverse correlation between the two. And that also is intuitive. If you're consuming, that's that much less you're going to save. If you're saving, you're foregoing consumption until a later time. So how do we actually take a look at this in the context of retirement? And how do we actually take a look at that retirement and see how inflation impacts choices pertaining to retirement? Well, first, we have a clue. And this chart here is from an academic that examined actually how different types of households experience inflation. These are not retiree households versus working households. These are lower income households versus higher income households. And the reason I put this chart here is to show that households with different income and different consumption baskets actually experience inflation differently. Unfortunately, inflation appears to impact lower income households more acutely. And this is unfortunate because their consumption floor is a considerable amount of their income. They do not have, comparatively, as much disposable income. So they are likely to be harder hit by inflation, and the price rises impact them more. Thinking about how this applies to retirement, well, certainly lower income retirees are going to have a harder time, but there are also many characteristics that we can consider looking at that different experience of inflation and figuring out how it's going to impact the savings up until retirement, the consumption up until retirement, and then the retirement experience. So first of all, I've outlined a few questions. Why understanding inflation is important to retirement security. Number one, inflation, all else equal, reduces real income and therefore purchasing power. In retirement specifically, income is commonly fixed, though possibly adjusted for inflation in retrospect, like we discussed with the cost of living adjustment in Social Security. And it may not be possible to demand additional wage income to offset the real income erosion. Next, uncertainty, dealing with uncertainty. Uncertainty or volatility in real income, especially in retirement, given the other two conditions that we discussed, the decrease in real income and the inability to demand higher wages, may contribute to financial stress and detract from peace of mind for consumers in retirement. So, when we take a look at inflation and retirement, what can we do? Well, problem number two here is that macro policy is reactive. It's blunt. It targets the aggregate. You can't make a different monetary policy for retired households or low-income households or any one cohort of the population. Monetary policy is made in aggregate. However, how it's made also involves a lot of study of various cohorts within the economy. And here is one place where policymakers, including the Fed, including the Bank of Japan, can start. So how can they do this? Well, number one, it's important to understand the Lucas critique. So the Lucas critique basically tells us not to draw conclusions from large econometric models alone. The econometric models certainly are important, and they're especially important for understanding what the economy is doing now. However, when we're looking for economic models that will help us forecast or help us formulate policy for the future, we also have to keep in mind that households actually adapt to and anticipate policy. So the macroeconometric models, even those based on big data, on AI, on data sets, even however cleverly fashioned, aren't going to help us formulate policy alone, even though they are very important. So backward-looking analysis of data is naive if we use it in isolation. How else can we do it? Well, understanding human behavior is an important thing to do. Why? Because even if human behavior can be very unpredictable, there are certain characteristics that, if better understood, can tell us why they are deviating from expectations. How can we incorporate those into the model? So micro foundations of macro models. That's one way that macro policy adjusts for human behavior. So how is this done? Generally speaking, in macro models, you have a bunch of, in general equilibrium models, you have a bunch of different sectors in the economy. And you have different actors that have different functions that they are trying to optimize. And in the end, one feeds into the other, which feeds into the other, and you solve this system of equations. So here, what's important to do, what it's important to keep track of is, for example, in the household's problem usually in large macro models, is maximizing its lifetime welfare subject to certain constraints, like budget constraints, or the fact that they value a certain mix of investment and consumption. They might value leaving a legacy for the next generation. They might have a consumption floor, so on and so forth. So the household maximizes their lifetime welfare, and so we have to figure out how best to measure it based on what we know of consistent human behavior today. Then we have firms who maximize profits in competitive markets. Their inputs are labor, capital, and they also have some ability to use technological progress to use those inputs more productively. And then we have the government, or we have, I say the government, but it can be any type of planner. It can be a pension plan sponsor. It can be a monetary policy maker. It can be a fiscal policy maker. It's the government function or the sponsor function in this problem. And the planner is maximizing aggregate welfare for everyone, such that households are at least as well off as they would be in the planner's absence. So I've outlined how macro models are created and where the micro fits in, for example, in the household, trying to input elements of human behavior that we know about. So in order to do this, we want to start with partial equilibrium. So we don't start with the whole economy as first and foremost. We have to figure out how we are going to incorporate each of those sectors. So when we start with partial equilibrium and then identify possible frictions that policy could impact, then we're well on our way to incorporating those micro foundations in large macro models. Starting with the household's problem, because the household's problem is, when we're talking about inflation and retirement, it is very much the household's problem, and it's the government's problem to figure out how they might be able to optimize the household's welfare. We take a look at a few of these partial models to examine the impact of inflation on consumption and savings over a household's life cycle. We also then examine the impact of volatility of inflation, so that uncertainty that we talked about before, volatility of inflation and its impact on consumption and savings. And then we take a look at the impact of inflation, so in terms of reduced real income, on labor supply decisions. And these are important, especially important in countries that are currently taking a look at revising their pension systems. France, for instance, there's a big uproar about extending the pensionable age. It's about working longer. What influences the choices to work longer? Because that's the other side of the government policy. That either compels retirement or allows retirement at earlier ages. Then we can use the models to derive the intuition from the data that we see, that macroeconometric data, as I mentioned before, the Lucas critique, just getting the data and figuring out what the data says isn't really enough to formulate policy. Looking at the data is important, but also deriving the intuition is equally important. So what I start off with doing here is introducing a few pretty simple models. So I start out with a simplified life cycle model. This is a micro model. This is not a macroeconomic model. This is a microeconomic model with a finite life cycle. So this is a stochastic model, a life cycle model that shows the impact of trend inflation on consumption and savings or household assets, however you'd care to refer to the phenomenon. Inflation and real income volatility also affect consumption and savings in the accumulation phase. And when I say the accumulation phase, I mean prior to retirement, when households make a decision either to consume or to save. Just some assumptions that I've input into the model. We have a maximum asset constraint, so assets can't grow ad infinitum. No borrowing is allowed. And that's perhaps in Japan, that's less questioned than it is in the US. When I introduced this constraint, people really question me because there's a lot of borrowing in the United States. Why did I do this? Well, it's to demonstrate the impact of real income on savings and consumption. Whereas if I introduced borrowing at the very outset, then it would be harder to identify the impact of the inflation versus the impact of other factors. Also preferences, so constant relative risk aversion, that simply means that households are somewhat risk averse, and they're risk averse, the trade-off that they would make for a sure thing is relative to their wealth. It's always proportional to their wealth. I assume a first working age of 25 and random real income. So the real income in this model, haves in bad times versus good. That's the random part of it, the stochastic part of the model. So when I run the model, there are a couple of things that are generated. The average consumption path. So this is from age 25 to age 85, the average hump-shaped consumption path. Why is it hump-shaped? Well, the intuition is probably because I've put a lending constraint on it. So you have to engage in precautionary savings. There's no real borrowing. You can save, but there's no borrowing from the future. I've generated 1,000 paths with random real income. And that's what, consumption, this is what consumption looks like. And then on the right-hand side, we have the average savings path. So as you see, you're saving up until retirement, after which you start decumulating, you start using your savings until age 85, which we assume is the terminal age. And we can change all of this, of course. I know that the average longevity is higher in Japan than it is in the United States. It was just an assumption that I introduced because you had to have some assumption. Now, what we do here is take a look at inflation as a constant tax on real income. So you have different levels of inflation that's more or less predictable, but potentially higher. So we go from 2%, then we see the orange line, 5%, and then 8%. And unsurprisingly, when inflation acts as a constant tax on real income, your consumption over the entire life cycle is lower. It just eats into your consumption proportionally over your entire life cycle if you're only varying inflation. On the right-hand side, we see savings. So this is perhaps a little bit less intuitive, not completely unintuitive, but thinking back to that chart where we saw near term, maybe some inverse correlation between savings and consumption, we actually see that inflation eats into savings as well to a lesser degree. But it's when we think about inflation and how it eats into consumption, it's also going to reduce the amount of real assets, of assets that you're going to be able to accumulate given your income is decreasing in real terms. So that's not entirely unintuitive. So this is one way to take a look at how inflation is going to impact the life cycle leading up to retirement. Then we take a look at what volatility in inflation does, and it gets a little bit more interesting, or maybe not necessarily as intuitive as before. So what I've done is a very, very simple way of varying income. So instead of your income halving in bad times, you either have no bad times, your income remains steady, so constant real income of $20,000, or you have 1 versus 1.5, so slightly volatile, and then the original hump-shaped consumption there, the red line there, where you have volatility in consumption and you have your income halves in bad times. And what we see is that in the most volatile, or as inflation gets more volatile, then we get more and more consistency, consumption smoothing over a lifetime. On the right-hand side, looking at that savings chart, the assets, the red area there, we see a lot more precautionary savings when we have volatility in inflation than we do when we have no volatility in inflation. That also makes sense, but it's interesting to see it modeled out, that volatility inflation is going to compel precautionary savings. So that was the theoretical portion on inflation and consumption and savings decisions leading up to retirement, as well as the impact of volatility on retirement savings as well as consumption. Now let's take a look at the data and see how the theory squares off against the data. So when I say data, I'm looking at US data, and this is a database that's provided, a survey database that's provided by AARP. And when we look at the first bullet point here, the survey data in July 2022. Why July 2022? That's why I provide the chart over there. That's when inflation had peaked at 8.4% annually. So July 2022, most households age 30 plus thought that the situation was worse than a year prior. Common reasons were higher expenses and the decline in value of investment. 78% were worried about prices rising faster than income. So here we have the decline in real income. So clearly, inflation, decline in real income, that's not a bad way to look at it. Next, when we look at adults 30 plus, a lot of them reported higher basic expenses, transportation and grocery especially, than a year ago in July 2022. And 45% cut back on basic expenses, 50% cut back on extras. So here we see in action inflation eroding consumption, as we saw in the theoretical model. So that ties in. So although only 17% of adults aged 30 plus expected their financial situation to be worse in 12 months, again in July 2022, 1 in 5 adults aged 50 plus expected their situation to decline over the next year. Near retirees and retirees are sensitive to changes in inflation expectations. And that's one of the assumptions that we introduced prior to the model, prior to the theoretical model. Next, households' housing costs and debt are the top barriers to saving, both for emergencies and retirement. Roughly 60% of adults aged 30 plus cite everyday expenses as a barrier to savings. So again, the model told us that inflation erodes savings. Here it is in the data. Last, when we take a look at adults aged 30 plus who are not retired, more than half expect to work in retirement or to never retire. So that we haven't seen in the model yet. But it tells us that inflation can impact labor supply choices. And that's actually what the next model is going to look at. Labor supply choice is a bit complex. There are trade-offs here. According to theory, a lower real wage produces an income effect, so that means you work longer to achieve the same consumption. But it can also produce a substitution effect. Leisure is cheaper. You substitute leisure for consumption. You leave the workforce. Which is correct? Well, it's complex. What are the factors that actually change the trade-offs? Well, here is one. Look at the left-hand side, and we're looking at 2 different levels of real income of 100 and then real income of 200. They are both impacted by the same factors of inflation. When we look at the wealthier household chooses to has a higher probability of working versus retiring than the less wealthy household. Now, does that actually make sense? The theory tells us that substitution wins out, but do we really see the wealthier households choosing to work more? Now we take a look, we vary it a little bit. We use the same model, but then we impose a consumption floor. We impose a consumption floor at gradually increasing levels. And we look at that, the level of basic expenses for the household, the lower income, or the household with a real income of 100, not the 2 times, the 200. And we see that as we vary that consumption floor, and that consumption floor is comparative to their income, so it's 0.1 versus 100, 25 versus 100, then we see that the decision to work longer prevails when the consumption floor goes to 50 and then to 100. So does it make sense in real life where people have consumption floors that you should choose to leave the labor force when inflation is at play? Well, not so much if you actually have a baseline consumption, which most people who are not independently wealthy do relative to their income. So let's take a look at the data again. What does the data say about retirement timing? So again, the data is complex. There are 2 opposing forces here. If we take a look at data from the Michigan Retirement Research Center, and they're the ones who actually run the Health and Retirement Study, the largest database on health and financial factors for longitudinal study for Americans over the age of 50. And they find that high inflation is associated with exit from the labor force through either partial as well as full retirements. And this is consistent with the substitution effect, that the wages aren't keeping up, real wages aren't keeping up, and that discourages labor force participation. At the same time, if we take a look at the right-hand side, there are people who are considering unretirement once retired. And I think I don't know if everybody can see the small print, but I'll read it to you. It's to combat rising costs due to inflation, supply chain. That was the top reason at the time. So that was at the end of 2022, which is correct. Again, if you have a consumption floor and that consumption floor is substantial relative to your income, then on the right-hand side, you're probably going to make different labor supply choices. You are going to consider on retiring. So that's essentially it when we take a look at the theoretical framework and look at some of the data from the US on the points that we've examined. We've taken a look at inflation, different levels of inflation, constant levels of inflation that act as a tax on income. We've taken a look at volatility of inflation that compels precautionary savings. And we've taken a look at labor supply choices, specifically working longer or on retiring. So these are all factors that are in the household's set of choices that they're going to have to make given inflation and given incipient retirement. How about other sectors of the economy? Well, I haven't really gone into other sectors of the economy in detail, but I did want to offer a preview of where they all fit in. So on the left-hand side, we're taking a look at some macro figures in the US, but actually you can decompose the industrial sectors in a similar way, which I've done for Japan actually. But you're taking a look at the factors of production, which are labor and capital, and then the orange line here, total factor productivity, which drives GDP growth long term. Where does this fit in with firms? Well, each of the firms are going to have to create a situation where they're balancing the factors of production, such as to keep TFP growing, pass through costs, introduce cost-reducing technology, and the more minute and micro you get into the economy, they're each going to have to do this at the firm level. And where does that also live? Well, it lives in the households in the US, the households portfolio, because there's a lot of investment in firms directly via mutual funds in people's 401ks. In Japan, not so much, but GPIF also has a portfolio. That ability of firms to keep productive and use the factors of production such as to continue remaining productive is going to be the backbone of the pension system. Next, the planner's problem. I mentioned that a planner can be the government, it can be the Fed, it can be the fiscal authority, but it can also be the administrators of a pension plan. Here we see a model that actually I didn't create. It was Aon and Nurse, the National Institute for Retirement Security, looking at defined benefit pension plans in the United States. Defined benefit pensions are the norm in the public sector only in the United States, whereas they're usually 401ks, defined contribution in the private sector. But as we see on the right-hand side, the cost of living adjustment is one big lever that a lot of the defined benefit pensions can use in order to make their benefits more attractive to prospective employees. They have to balance that off against staying solvent, for instance. They also, and over the recent years, what's happened is that with inflation so low, people haven't really been focused on the cost of living adjustments. So that's one of these things that has gotten whittled away. So it's been a de facto decrease in pension benefits. People didn't mind so much when inflation was low. I suspect that they will mind a lot more with inflation higher. And keep in mind that the Social Security model, the adjustment with a lag to inflation, that's the gold standard of cost of living adjustments. Almost every other defined benefit pension plan, at least in the United States, public fund is less of an adjustment, either more lagged or discretionary or just no adjustment at all. Social Security is still the gold standard. So this is something that the government is probably going to have to revisit, local governments too in the United States and in Japan, then Kosenenking as well. There's probably going to have to be another big look at cost of living adjustments. Now, I guess you can't just get money from nowhere. So that might also be consistent with things, especially given the longevity, with prolonging with pushing back the pensionable age, either that or collecting more taxes. It's still an additional problem to an already complex set of questions pertaining to retirement and pensions amongst developed countries as a whole. And so that's essentially it. I've included some references here for anyone. I mean, they're very small, but I can certainly forward along the presentation. There are links attached, and then there's a bunch of math in the appendix that probably nobody wants to look at. So I will. They're just basically looking at the models. So I'll probably leave it here and take any questions that people might have.
Okay, well, speak up now or hold your peace forever. So questions, if you could please introduce yourself.
I'm John Mock, teacher at Temple. I'm really curious. I happen to get pensions both from Japan and the United States.
Yes.
And I'm way over the average retirement age. So with the impact of healthcare, in Japan there's a fairly decent national healthcare system. In the United States there isn't. I'm being a little crude, but the United States has the highest cost for healthcare per capita,
Yes.
and not particularly good results from that. Where does that come into this? I mean, for me personally, that's a major issue about living in Japan as opposed to the United States.
Yes. Yeah, and you're right. It comes in a very uncomfortable way for many retirees or prospective retirees in the United States. We took a look at the CPIE earlier. Now, as you might imagine, medical costs are a much larger proportion of the CPIE than they are of the regular CPI. Medical costs in the United States, I think, have been rising too at a much higher rate than inflation, 10 to 20% sometimes, much higher. The cost of medical care in retirement is, there is Medicare, but then there are many things that aren't covered by Medicare. For example, long-term care. So there is long-term care insurance. However, long-term care insurance, as you would imagine, is expensive. And probably any kind of insurance in a low-rate environment is going to be more than. Well, I mean, if we take a look at annuities, for example, a lot of insurance product in low-rate environments were more than people wanted to spend, even though there's no real other way to insure against longevity. There's no real other way to insure against long-term medical costs. I don't think that anyone has a wonderful solution to that. I think definitely, is there a value globally to universal health care? Absolutely, there is. And is there a greater value for retirees who are likelier to incur the costs of medical costs, especially large ones like long-term care? Yes, definitely there is. I think in the United States too, sometimes people don't realize the value of some of their annuitized income streams that they have, like Social Security, and sometimes people start claiming earlier, when you can actually you can optimize by delaying claiming until age 70, and then get what's probably an actuarially fair income stream, just because you get less given you start from 70 as opposed to 65 or 62, which is the earlier age. However, you do get a lifetime income, an annuitized stream of income for, and you don't have to pay separately for it. So I think that there are many issues when it comes to things like medical care costs, and even kind of household decision making when it pertains to any type of insurance or annuitized stream of income.
Richard, what is CPIE?
CPIE is it's kind of like the CPI inflation basket. CPI. Oh, right. Okay. So it's the basket of goods that consumers will. Consumer price index.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Right. What is the sample? Yes. And then I think CPIE is CPI elderly, because it's only the consumption baskets of people over 65. I don't remember the exact age, but I think it's 65. And then so that's why medical care is going to be a larger chunk. Housing is also going to be a significant. Although, yeah, I mean, I guess housing fluctuates. I mean, they're not necessarily going to be paying mortgages. It's like it will be owner's equivalent rents. So yeah, it's the consumption basket of the elderly is significantly different, and their consumption habits are significantly different. And the interesting thing too is that their consumption habits change over retirement too. In early retirement, the consumption a lot of times differs, especially those with higher disposable income. It differs from late retirement as well. Those who have the consumption floor as a larger proportion of income is less variable.
Michael Chuchek, Asian Studies here at THA. I'm not really clear on how or what the Lucas critique is in this case.
Yes.
Is it on household behavior on a micro level? Is it on macro responses? Or what is the Lucas critique in this instance?
In this instance, the Lucas critique tells us that we can make macro policy based on what we think is going to be, what we think households are going to respond to. When we disaggregate the economy into different sectors, in this case, let's say retirees and non-retirees, then we know that they're going to react differently. For example, if they have a consumption floor. Therefore, if we build that into our policy, into our model, rather than just looking at what households are doing now and then reacting to that, we are likely to have a better tool. So let's see. If we take a look at, let me use a non-retirement example.
Would it help? Is in the Lucas critique, is it arguing for action or inaction? And is it for action by policymakers or action or inaction by the household? I'm unclear on where in the economy it's being applied.
Okay, the Lucas critique does not argue for action or inaction on the part of an economic sector. It argues for policy formulation based on understanding of not only existing data, so the past, but then also incorporating intuition about human behavior that doesn't change. For instance, I'd like to give one example that I like. It's not a retirement example, but it makes things maybe a little bit clearer. There was a study that took a look at the Fed during the Volcker era, an era of very high inflation. And then I think received wisdom is that the Volcker Fed brought inflation under control through policy. which may be true. However, there was a paper that took a look at simulating the Volcker policy in an era of trend low inflation, and it hardly did anything at all. So the Volcker policy was suitable for a high inflation period. It wasn't an all-weather policy. So understanding the difference between what's an all-weather policy, so monetary policy is, it's natural that you react to inflation and inflation expectations at the time, versus things that are all-weather, like pensions. People are going to retire. They're going to have to need some sort of income in retirement. They're going to make decisions during their life cycle, savings and consumption decisions that are not dependent necessarily on, or you want to make them independent of the macroeconomic environment now, because you don't know what the macroeconomic environment is going to be when they retire. So it's one way of making it not as specific to just recently experienced history, and trying to project, especially in retirement, we have to project way out into the future when we are uncertain about our income until then. We're uncertain about fiscal policy, for instance. We don't know what monetary policy is going to be doing at the time. We just have to basically do our best. And I guess received wisdom is understand what you're going to have in terms of income streams, Social Security or other annuitized income streams, plus personal savings. So then if we don't know what's going to happen in the future, the only thing we really can do is understand what influences savings behavior, consumption behavior, and then make policy accordingly, so we don't just focus on the immediate past. Very important when we're looking at developed countries, especially Japan, that we haven't seen inflation for quite a long time, and inflation inflation expectations are very persistent. So even though people might feel the discomfort of inflation, they're not going to be that quick to make long-term decisions as if that inflation were here to stay. So how do you combat that? Well, it's tough. I mean, financial literacy, there are these big 5 questions that Anna Maria Lusardi and a bunch of other academics came up with and applied all over the world in different countries that, to gauge financial literacy. And it's maybe some of the questions are not necessarily fully universal, but it attempts to look at some of the big financial concepts like compounding, like inflation, like risk diversification. So let's take inflation out, because inflation is the question at hand. What you want people to start doing is understanding inflation and saving and consuming with that understanding from an early age, because the longer you can actually compound your savings, then and that's going to impact what you have in terms of assets at retirement. If you have a population, especially young people today, who are not, they've never experienced inflation, they're probably not going to act as if they're going to be in an inflationary circumstance in retirement. But they might be, especially given recent developments. So it's not a perfect fix, but probably introducing things like financial literacy, education about some of these things that people haven't experienced, like inflation, is very important. I'm an advocate of doing this.
Limits of knowledge problem in terms of planners, for planners, that they are unable to see the variability in human behavior for events that we have not yet experienced.
Yeah, but they have tools, right? They have tools that they can fight back against that, not only relying on recent data by using the theoretical models. What if we were to have a protracted inflation regime? I mean, it hasn't happened yet, so these tools aren't perfect. They're models. They're not real life, but that's all we have.
Questions? How does this differ between Japan and the US? Because Japan is a very different demography.
Yes.
Are there implications of this for Japanese policymakers?
Yeah, so the demography, as far as aging and as far as longevity, then the trends are similar, although Japan is more advanced. One of the advantages that Japan has is that there's not really a lack of household savings. Perhaps there's been an over savings and there's been an allocation toward cash and cash equivalents. That doesn't do very well in inflation. It's logical, it's rational considering decades of disinflation, if not deflation. Especially when you had the GPIF not adjusting the cost of living index for deflation, you make out. You're basically able to consume more tomorrow because deflation does the work for you. But now, if we're in a different regime and we're in an inflationary regime, that strategy isn't going to work too well. And it's good that the savings is there to begin with. That's like Japan is probably ahead of the United States significantly. It's in terms of actually saving. A lot of American households don't even have enough for emergency saving, to cover an emergency. That's $400. That's a big statistic that's thrown out a lot. So Japan is ahead in many ways there, but potentially what we're going to have to take a look at is how those assets are allocated. It might not be as easy as it was up until now. Inflation is likelier to erode that built up store of assets than it was in a disinflationary, deflationary time. So that's one. Also, when we're talking about pension reform, and this is applicable to probably all developed economies that take a look at how they can deal with greater longevity, like France, for instance, and how they can deal with higher dependency rates. Well, I guess very simply, you either have to collect more, the taxes, or you have to pay out less. But you're going to have to figure out how it's going to actually be sustainable and palatable. So, for example, in France, the idea was to move out the pensionable age. That doesn't seem that palatable. But then the alternative is to collect more taxes. So, I guess it's going to be nobody probably wants to do either of those things, either get paid less or have to pay out of pocket more. But it's going to probably have to be one or the other. And that's the same for Japan as well. And it might not be as hard for Japan as in other countries that don't have this large savings surplus. They are going to have to probably overcome the maybe it's the aversion to risk assets, or it's also rational if there's already a deflationary environment, and that's what you can expect until retirement. Then why diversify into risk assets? Well, the why now might be coming in the form of inflation, because you will have lower purchasing power if you hold zero yielding assets in an inflationary environment.
Just as a comment, Japan does have an old people's tax.
Yes.
A very substantial one, I happen to know, which actually increases my overall income tax component by about 50%.
Yes.
Now, I pay much lower income tax in Japan than I would equivalently in the United States.
Yes.
But still, that 50% is a very substantial. And this
Yes.
is something that continues up until a certain point and then starts dropping off. But I've noticed it's actually increasing over the last 15 years.
Yes.
So what they're doing in Japan is actually adding, old people are actually paying a tax for being old people.
Right.
Which to a certain extent cancels out the extra costs.
Well, it will be revenue for the government to be able to pay out benefits.
But it is a cost for the old people.
It's a cost for the old people. And then, how can you actually, how can you develop incentives for people to take care of it themselves? Well, I guess, if for instance, one were to raise the tax-free threshold for defined contribution, then presumably the withdrawal of defined contribution, actually it's triple tax-free, isn't it? It's just a very low threshold. If you were actually to raise that, then you'd be able to get around that tax by taking out of the defined contribution after spending the many years.
Well, they could also just raise the overall income tax. I mean, there's a.
Yes, yeah,
which is
certainly.
They're now doing
Yes.
consumption tax
Right.
instead.
Yes,
So you have a regressive tax replacing a progressive tax.
Yes.
Which is becoming increasingly regressive.
yeah, yes. Well, I think one of the reasons why consumption tax was chosen is that it's very broadly based. But yeah, it's not progressive.
It sticks in poor people more than wealthy people.
Sure.
And wealthy people control the system.
Yes. Yes, and then what we've seen with inflation too, it can even hurt more in an inflationary environment. So in that case, what do? You can do an income transfer, or you can design a tax that's more progressive,
Which is not,
or you can like Social Security in the United States is progressive. So you can design an income system that's more progressive, but then that would make some people unhappy, probably the higher income earners, because that would be transferring to lower income households. Yet, as you mentioned, it's the lower income households are the ones with the high consumption floor. So, I mean, there's if you're the government and you're trying to, one of your goals is to not allow households to fall below, I mean, that would be poverty, right? So it's the redistribution of income may be merited.
What's this old person's tax?
It's a tax that once you pass a certain age, you have to pay.
But what's it called? I
Oh my
assume it's-
goodness.
I assume it's not called an old person's tax.
Well, actually, it's roughly that, yeah. It's, oh my goodness.
And when does it kick in?
I think it kicks in when you're 70.
70. Okay.
Now, I have to admit, my partner does my taxes. We don't threaten our local community with me walking in with money. I mean, I can do them. Japanese taxes are very easy compared to American taxes, but they're still, well, my taxes are very easy. But they're still, my partner's an accountant.
They're very easy.
And she will, I don't want to say she doesn't trust my accounting, but she's much better at it than I am. So, it's also her native language, which
So
shows.
whatever it's called, it makes sense in terms if persons who are elderly do not consume at the rates that people who are middle-aged do, that the state expropriates from them money that they're not going to use for consumption and replaces it with the state spending.
Well, and puts in things like national health, which, I mean, at least in my case, the benefits I've got from national health far outweigh the amount of money I put in as old people's tax. Or even what I still am paying into national health for that. When I was at a national university, my national health costs were much, much, much higher.
Also,
My income is much higher too.
but also when we're looking at just the not only the generational impact, but then also the income impact. Just I mean, a few years ago, when I took a look at when people were looking at the Japanese wealth gap, then it was very apparent that the Japanese wealth gap was growing very differently than the U.S. wealth gap, where basically in the U.S. then it was more, I guess, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Whereas in Japan, it was kind of part and parcel of deflation. Those who were asset owners, those who had capital, were in nominal terms staying put because of deflation. They were making small gains. Wage earners were actually getting wages cut, and they were subject to the deflation. So the wealth gap grew also on the basis of either having assets or making a wage. So it's possibly a reversal of, I mean, a very imperfect one, reversal of some of the dynamics of the deflationary decades.
So that in Japan, the poor were getting poorer.
Everybody was kind of, I guess, in
Rich.
real terms, not getting poorer.
Because there's
in nominal
a fair amount
terms.
of research now
Yeah.
on poverty in Japan,
Right,
which
yeah.
I think is relatively under
Right.
researched
Yes.
to some extent.
Yes, the poor were getting,
The idea we're all a middle class society.
oh, right, yes,
Doesn't really apply.
yes. Sure, yeah,
I often have Japanese I know who are not
Right.
middle class, but
Yes.
upper class. Who say,
Yes.
well, everybody's middle class in Japan.
yes,
They're no super rich. The fact is, the wealth gap is not as large as the US.
Right.
But there are people who are very rich.
Yes.
There certainly are people now who are poor.
Yes.
Who are not middle class. by
Right.
any means.
yes,
But under terms of human behavior,
Yeah.
deflation nets the ties you against feeling that you're getting poorer. Because you would see, oh, my yen are going farther now. So that.
But not
even
if
though-
you're a
even
wage
if-
earner.
Hmm?
Not if you're a wage earner because they're cutting your wages.
But it's very difficult to do that.
Oh.
You do it on, you can't do it to the main wage, but you
Yeah.
can certainly do it to the bonuses.
Right, but the thing is, I mean, they did. Bank of Japan did a study on in which country, U.S. or Japan, was there greater wage elasticity, and it was Japan, basically because of downside. Because you can cut wages in Japan. In the U.S., you just eliminate jobs.
Oh, I see, okay, so,
Okay, but also in terms of wages, I don't think it's disaggregating permanent positions versus temporary
It would
ones.
have-
Even in permanent positions, sometimes there was like a wage decline that not often, but like in
Oh, in
Recessionary.
2008 and stuff,
Yeah.
No, that was,
Mhm.
the whole deal is, so we'll all take a 20% cut instead of firing someone.
Yeah.
Deal.
yeah.
But
Which in
isn't
the United
it
States
still
they just
more
fire.
difficult legally to fire people in Japan than it is? in
I
the
would
States?
imagine so, but then I think, is it 40%? It's like there's a really high rate of contract employment, and you can just not renew contracts in downturns, which has the same effect as eliminating
Actually,
jobs.
there's a stickiness to that
Mhm.
because there's a certain point, if you've hired someone for, let's say, 10 years
Mhm.
and then decided don't continue,
Mhm.
if the person really gets uppity in Japan,
Yeah,
they can make life very difficult because then a company would have to say, why is this person no longer?
Right.
Especially when they changed the law in 2012, the
Mhm.
Labour Contracts Act.
Yes.
But the trick is first getting to that 5-year stage where you can then say, give me a job without an end date.
right. Yeah, yes.
Just a quick question. I'm not an economist, but I'm kind of curious if the model builds into the idea of housing prices, and certainly like as a
Yes.
reprieve for inflation, ownership of a house seems to, especially for seniors, to alleviate some. In Japan, housing prices have typically diminished over time.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious your thoughts about that, and any thoughts about Warren Buffett's sunny optimism?
Right. So housing, certainly in the United States, housing has recovered quite massively since the global financial crisis. So if you were, and actually housing is where most of the wealth is created in the United States. Is it a good hedge against inflation? I'm not necessarily sure it's going to be a wonderful hedge against inflation just because it's not very liquid. However, if you consider the retiree, then if you have somebody who's paid off their mortgage or close to paying off their mortgage at retirement, and we have a trend inflation situation, rates are high, so mortgages are more expensive, and rents are high, then obviously it's going to be much more favorable to have done that. Additionally, for retirees, long-term care, a lot of times, and this happens in Japan too, like a lot of times if you have that house as your main asset, then in the US, like sometimes people don't necessarily sell, they might take out a reverse mortgage. But it's a chunk of capital that you can use for long-term care, and having it versus not having it makes a big difference.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions or comments?
Yes.
Just, is there any sense of dissent in terms of intergenerational equity, in terms of the options that are available to adjust in inflationary environments?
Yeah, so intergenerational equity, I think is that is something that's very different in the United States versus in Japan, especially given, in Japan, certainly, if you already had capital, then you're going to be better off than people who are subject to a deflationary wage regime. So then transfer of wealth in in an aging society, then I guess, especially given cash savings, then that might be beneficial. In the United States, households aren't savers mostly. There's a big gap between those who do have things like housing wealth and those who do not have housing wealth. There are also huge racial gaps in the United States, huge. That's like years of things like redlining and just structural inequities. I think there probably are structural inequities in Japan, but just not, I guess, not in exactly the same way. I think that there's probably no real solution other than to somehow transfer the wealth between generations. Of course, like if you have housing wealth in the United States, that happens. If you have housing wealth in Japan, that typically happens. I guess there's inheritance tax, but that's not very well collected in Japan. It's not very. I think that's one of the reasons why they opted for a consumption tax, because it's much easier to collect. When I spoke to some of the Japanese officials, there was a real. And then I spoke about things like the U.S. 401k defined contribution system, and while there was a lot of eagerness to actually build some sort of saving system that can help households diversify their wealth, there was a real reluctance to create a potentially engineered situation where you had a very regressive pension formula, where a lot of those who did best, who had the best tax treatment, were the ones that were already wealthy. So I suspect that there may be an expansion of the defined contribution system in Japan. There probably will be, but I would imagine that the tax regime is not going to be similar to that of the United States, which is very different from Social Security. It's regressive. It does benefit higher income households. Higher income middle class households, because if you're ultra wealthy, then 401ks are not going to be a large part of your wealth. In the United States, they already did to limit the amount of transfer you can do directly from individual retirement accounts. You actually have to, you have a limit whereby you have to start withdrawing and paying tax on it. So I would imagine that if you do have a situation in Japan too, where it's like right now defined contribution is triple tax free, I would imagine that they'd want to limit it within that generation and then make it subject to tax. Otherwise, it could potentially widen wealth gaps, and it's my perception that policymakers don't want.
Well, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Thank you for taking the time to brief us and enlighten us.
Sure.
So thank you for all our participants. If you want to be on our email list, just give me your business card and we'll make sure to add you to the list. So thanks again.